Well, first of all, Susan, Peter, thank you for being here with us. We're really grateful that you're here.
Well, we were very honored to be here. Thank you so much for including us in this special occasion.
Thank you. Let me ask you with a couple of personal questions. How can you write so many books together and keep your marriage intact?
You know, I thought all the tough questions were going to go to Peter, but I want to thank you. As you can see, we are still married, still speaking to each other, so we managed to figure out how to write books together and make it work. But you know, actually our partnership started the same year as the New York Times partnership with your newspaper, and we've been working together and building a family ever since. So we're delighted to be here to celebrate with you.
Great, thank you. And Peter, you're Greek, right?
I do agree, yes.
Yeah. And how Greek are you, and what was your original name?
How Greek am I? Okay. I'm half Greek. My father's family is Greek. The original name was Bakizidis. My papu and my yaya came over from Asia Minor in the early 20th century. And they settled in a place in West Virginia, of all places, and had my father.
Did you learn any Greek?
I'm afraid I did not learn very much Greek. I'm afraid not. Not enough, anyway.
Okay, well, this is a good opportunity to start, I think, right?
Yes, thank you.
You've written books about Russia, because you've been in Moscow. You were in Israel for, what, a few weeks, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I want to start a bit with the foreign policy kind of landscape. Russia, is there Ukraine fatigue in Washington? I mean, we see that it's very difficult to get aid through Congress and so on. What does this really mean in practical ways?
You know, I do think that the American public, you know, is broadly speaking been remarkably supportive of Ukraine, and that can get lost. You know, ever since February of last year, you have seen really around the country and in both parties a lot of support for Ukraine. But in many ways, I think the story of what's happening right now in Washington as far as aid for Ukraine goes, it's a story, unfortunately, about where the Republican Party is headed in the United States. And, you know, it's led by someone, Donald Trump, who has consistently been a fan of Vladimir Putin and who has been very skeptical of Ukraine even before the invasion. People may not know this, but Donald Trump once told the president of Ukraine before Zelensky in the Oval Office of the White House, "I don't believe that you have a real country." He said that to the president, Poroshenko. So I think what you're seeing this week with Congress once again sort of not acting, it's a lot about a story about where Republican politicians in America, where they think their own party is going as opposed to where it is today. And probably that's a fair guess. I think that by next year, it's hard to imagine that you're going to get billions and billions of dollars more for Ukraine.
Okay, but I think it's a fair question to ask, what is the end game? I mean, all this money from the US and Europe and so on. Does anybody talk about, you know, what the end game should be like and whether Zelensky can actually deliver an end game?
Yeah, they talk about the end game all the time. They just don't agree on what it is. There is obviously some tension in Washington between the camp that believes that Zelensky and Putin will eventually have to negotiate a solution, and those who say, no, there's no such thing as a negotiated solution with Putin as long as he's there. And for the most part, it's the latter group that has the ear of the president. But it's easy to see how that could change. And Putin's response to what you're talking about, the Ukraine fatigue, to what Susan's talking about in terms of the money, Putin's response is easy. He's waiting it out. He's waiting out America because he thinks America is going to blink. He thinks America may return Donald Trump to office next November, and if Donald Trump does, that's the end of American support for Ukraine, and he's not wrong about that.
Now, has the crisis in Gaza affected the way the US is dealing with Ukraine, you think?
It has, I think, to some extent. It's taken that off the front pages of the paper, not our paper. The New York Times is still covering the Ukraine on the front pages, but in terms of the conversation, Gaza and Israel have become the #1 discussion point, and that's reminded Americans that, you know, now we have 2 wars that the Biden administration would like to fund, and that has caused more stress on the argument that we need to get money and arms to Ukraine. Now, President Zelensky is going to come to Washington tomorrow to remind Washington why it's still important, and we'll see how well that goes. His first visit to Washington was very effective in making Ukraine's case. His second one a little less so. And so it's an important day tomorrow. We'll see the answer to your question a little bit more clearly.
Now, I know both of you have spent a lot of time analyzing the relations between various US presidents and Bibi Netanyahu. He's been there, they keep changing, I guess. How complicated is the relation between Biden and Bibi right now? And what exactly is the administration trying to achieve? And is it achievable in the end?
Yeah, I mean, look, we are seeing right now, all of us are seeing not only this horrible war unfolding, but it's a story in many ways about what are the limits of U.S. ability to get its own way, to exercise its influence with Netanyahu, despite the enormous amount of money, despite, you know, what they're calling Biden's strategy in Washington is the bear hug strategy, right? He's hugging Bibi close, and the idea is by doing that, that you would then be able to really exert influence, you know, privately in a way that matters. But you look at the conduct of the war inside Gaza, and it's very hard to discern really a measurable American impact. And I personally believe this is a major crisis, not only in the U.S. relationship with Israel, but it's showing that the politics inside America have shifted. And it's true that the majority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, are still very supportive of Israel. So in some ways, the protests are not reflective of where the mass of Americans are. But I think that Netanyahu has become so identified in the United States and his party and his government with the Republican Party at a time when, as you know, our own politics is disastrous and so divisive. Young Americans, in particular liberal young Americans, do not have the same feeling of support for Israel, and many of them are very concerned headed into an election year about what they see as President Biden's uncritical backing.
Have you been surprised by how vicious and how toxic the debate is about these issues?
Oh my goodness, you know, Peter and I...
University campuses and so on?
Absolutely. Peter and I have a son who is a sophomore at Stanford University, and like many of the other universities you've read about in the United States, the conflict there is real in a way that I cannot remember. It's like nothing in really the last few decades. There were swastikas inside our son's dorm that were found. You know, there have been enormous controversies over free speech and the like. My own alma mater, you know, the president, Claudine Gay, was one of 3 university presidents who testified last week before Congress, and to be blunt, it was a disaster. I mean, it was just a disaster. And I think these university campuses are unfortunately a little bit of a preview of where politics is headed, not only in our country, but probably in Europe as well.
Now, Peter, I want to ask you, what is Biden trying to achieve? It seems to me that he's giving a bit of tough love to Israel. The question is he trying to look beyond Netanyahu? Is this sort of the long game?
Yeah, I think so. I was with President Biden when he gave his first speech after October 7th, and the anger in his voice, the very personal nature that he took that attack, I think was genuine. And I've never heard a president, and I've covered 5 now, who seemed quite that angry about something that happened to another country overseas, and he took it personally. And then I was with him on Air Force One when he flew to Israel for the day a few days later, and his goal, as Susan said, was to hug Netanyahu. I stood 10 feet away as he literally gave Netanyahu a hug. But you can see that he's whispering in Netanyahu's ear, right, figuratively, if not literally. And he is trying to shape the outcome of this thing. And I do think they've had impact. They have kept Israel from expanding the war to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is something that was talked about at first. They have forced Israel to do more to open up Gaza for humanitarian aid, not as much as anybody would like, but more than the Israelis were originally willing to do. The original ground invasion was smaller and delayed than it had originally been planned, but it's not been enough, as Susan says, for the people who are upset at all of the obvious thousands and thousands of deaths that are happening in Gaza. And so Biden's trying to find a way to influence them without losing that public sense of support. And yes, he is playing the long game beyond Netanyahu. He will be there for whoever is next. Because his point is, his point to the Israelis is, I don't particularly like Bibi personally. We are on different sides in a lot of ways, but I am still with you, Israel, regardless of who your leader is. So I think whoever comes next will feel that Biden is on their side. Right now, my understanding is that Biden is the most popular politician in Israel.
Can I ask both of you who is in charge of U.S. foreign policy?
Well, you know, it's interesting, but I would say that Biden himself really is, that he, you know, sometimes you say, well, the president has a lot of experience on this, and, you know, the truth is it's actually not him. It's his national security advisor, his secretary of state. But remember that for Biden, this is the issue that he cares about, is American foreign policy. And before he was the vice president for 2 terms, he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Biden has been doing this for so long. He was actually chosen to be the floor manager when NATO expanded, you know, 2 decades ago.
He was visiting with Golda Meir, as he always said, right?
Exactly. So he, you know, he personally has been involved in many of the structural debates, much of the legislation that has shaped the transatlantic order that we're living in. So, and actually you see it in some positive ways, but also some negative ways as well. For example, the war in Ukraine. There's been a lot of concern by some of the big supporters of Ukraine in Washington. Why has that America has been very supportive, but it's also sort of given this weapon system, then it's had months of debate, then another weapon system. A lot of concern, was it too slow? Was it sort of too little, too late? And my reporting for the New Yorker suggests that that was all Biden himself. He's a cautious politician. He likes to find his way to the middle of wherever the debate is. And I think that in many ways, he was courageous. He planted a flag. He said the United States is going to be with Ukraine as long as it takes. That was a political risk. I don't think that if there was a different president of the United States right now, certainly not Trump, but even possibly if it was Kamala Harris, I don't know that they would have been as strong in supporting Ukraine. But I also don't know that they would have micromanaged the decision-making around how to support Ukraine as much as Joe Biden.
Now, how active is Biden in decision-making? And when you look at the whole mix, Jake Sullivan as a security advisor, Tony Blinken, Bill Burns at the CIA, and so on, who are the key players, and how much does he listen to them?
Well, you just named some of them, of course, obviously. Tony Blinken and Joe Biden have been together now for more than 20 years or so. He likes Tony Blinken very much. They're very close. I think he's very fond of Jake Sullivan as well. I think that threesome is really the most important in terms of policy making on foreign affairs. Bill Burns is obviously a super important character as well, and there are others. But you name the 3. I think if it's Biden, Blinken, and Sullivan are really the most key characters. You have people like Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, and others, but really it's those 3 because they have been together, they trust each other, they understand each other. Tony Blinken is almost like a son to Joe Biden in a lot of ways, and I think that they understand each other in a way that you don't even have to say words out loud sometimes. So Susan said, you know, a lot of the decisions are really Biden. That's absolutely true. But they're put in place by people who get what Biden wants without even needing to ask him because they understand where he comes from.
Now, Susan, I want to get the second part of the conversation. You just wrote a column saying it's time to get depressed in Washington, D.C. Usually when
I think the word I said was panic.
Panic, yes. Panic, even better, yes. So when you panic, we usually panic as well here, as you can imagine. One of the major theses was that Biden might lose, that there's a very good chance that Biden might lose. You actually believe that?
Yes, and I think that anyone who can tell you with certainty that he won't lose is telling you something that you probably should discount very heavily. The reality of our politics in the United States today is even after all of the disruptions of the Trump era, the country is so divided between the 2 parties. It's almost inflexible. If you look, it's Biden's approvals that have gone up and down, but Donald Trump, he's supported more or less by the same people that he was supported by on January 5th of 2021. All of the events, his basically unprecedented attack on American democracy essentially did not result in any meaningful long-term change in Republicans' willingness to support him. And given that, it's pretty much a 50-50 country. And of course, Biden's biggest liability right now is absolutely his age. He's already the oldest president of the United States ever. And if he were to be reelected to a second four-year term, he would be 86 years old at the end of that term. And so this liability, as Peter often says, is not, there's nothing he can do about it. And almost every single day of the campaign, it potentially becomes a bigger problem.
Do you think Biden realizes the enormous challenge ahead of him and how, you know, I mean, he keeps saying that if Trump was not running, he wouldn't run either, right? I mean, so is anybody going to tell him the truth that, you know, his numbers are very bad and that, you know, he might have to pull out? And how long does he have in order to do this? I mean, how much time does he have in terms?
I mean, we're basically done. I mean, the filing deadlines for any other Democrat to run are in the next week or two for the most of the states that matter. So at this point, there's almost no chance of a serious challenge to Biden in the primaries. He is going to run. People who ask if he's not going to run or change his mind, do not count on that. I mean, the only thing that could change that is if some event occurs that we're not currently aware of. If he has a health issue of some sort, maybe that would change things. He does not want to change his mind. He believes, and he believes strongly, that he beat Trump last time. He's the only Democrat who beat Trump, and therefore he will beat him again, and that you and I and all the pundits out there who tell him that his poll numbers are bad are misreading the situation, and we are constantly underestimating him. He says, look at what happened. I won in 2020 when you didn't think I could. I won. The Democrats won in 2022 when you didn't think we would, and the Democrats won in 2023 when you didn't think we would. You guys are wrong. So he may be right. We don't know. But the polls don't suggest that. And the polls are very grim. And most Democrats that Susan and I talk to, and we talk to a lot, are very upset and very worried and very nervous about this because they don't see the situation getting any better. The economy is actually in pretty good shape for a lot of reasons. Inflation, which is the biggest negative for Biden, has come down. Unemployment's at or near a record low. The economy grew 5% last year, which is faster than any time when Trump was president before the pandemic. And yet most Americans think the economy is doing terribly. He's not getting any credit for it. So nobody's going to tell him that he's going to listen to that he's not going to run again. He believes that he is the best chance for the country of keeping Trump out of the Oval Office.
Any chance that somebody like Nikki Haley or somebody like this could beat Trump in the primaries, or is it very slim?
Well, look, hope springs eternal. So, you know, politics is a business of surprises. I don't rule anything out. Here's a little data point just from today. There's a very well-respected poll in Iowa, which, as you know, is the very first state that has its caucus, in the case of Iowa, to pick its Republican nominee. And in that well-respected Iowa poll today of Republicans, Donald Trump's support for all of the attention to Nikki Haley is going up, not down. In fact, Donald Trump right now has the largest lead in the history of the polling for the Iowa caucus, okay? So, by the way, Donald Trump overall, not just in Iowa, has the largest lead right now of any Republican primary candidate. No one has ever lost the nomination with a lead that large. Do I rule it out? Absolutely not. There are some deep problems that Donald Trump has in both Iowa and New Hampshire, two of the early states. He's less popular than he is overall in other states in the country. So maybe somebody pulls off an upset, has a very good second place finish, that turns into a lot of media coverage. But, you know, as I'm sure many of you didn't think Donald Trump was going to win the election in 2016. And nobody's probably going to make that mistake again of thinking that he can't win just because it seems inconceivable.
Now, I heard Trump the other day saying, the baker of the New York Times is saying that I'll become a dictator. Is he going to become a dictator?
Well, he told us he wants to be a dictator. He says it's
for
just
one
for one day.
For one
right.
day, yeah, that's it.
So, of course, the history will show that dictators who are dictators for one day don't usually become undictators the next day. But we'll see what he says. I mean, what's fascinating about the conversation about dictatorship in America is that we're having it. This is not a conversation that we're used to in the United States where we're having a serious discussion. Now, we often throw that term out. Bush is a dictator, Obama's a dictator, Nixon's a dictator, FDR's a dictator. We've used that term a lot with our presidents. But really, we've never meant it in the way that we're talking about right now. And why do we think this? It's not because the Democrats are calling him a dictator. It's because he himself is leaning into it. He's not denying it, he's leaning into it. He says, I am going to use the power if I get back to punish the people who came after me. I'm going to get rid of civil servants at the highest level and only put in political people who will listen to me. I'm going to get rid of the autonomy of various agencies in the government, have them respond to me. I'm going to use the military and put them in the streets if there are protests that get out of hand. He himself said he was for the termination of the Constitution. The termination of the Constitution. Why? So that he could be returned to the presidency and Joe Biden could be taken out right now without waiting for an election. Not going to happen, but the fact that it's not going to happen doesn't mean that that isn't indicative of his view of the Constitution. So when people say, is he going to be a dictator? Maybe not. Maybe it's all just him being a provocateur, but when somebody tells you how they are, you ought to at least think about what he's saying.
One thing that struck me, you said last night when we were talking, Susan, is that actually the accusation of being a dictator is not that unpopular among segments of the population, even the young, right, in the US?
You know, Donald Trump would not be talking about it if he didn't think it was helping him with his most fervent supporters. And I think, for me, the experience of the last 7 years of Trump in politics, it's about realizing that once somebody goes past the guardrails in our politics, you can go much, much farther than any of us ever understood. And so I don't think that the United States is the same country that it was in 2015 when Donald Trump entered American politics. We are not only having conversations that would be once unthinkable, but, you know, if in 2016 Donald Trump talked about shocking things or spent his time as a president criticizing America's allies and looking up to its adversaries, people like Putin or Xi Jinping, his admiration for dictators. Now he's talking about actually executing those things, right? So you've seen an escalation in his rhetoric that I think we need to take very seriously, as Peter said, but it's all about the unthinkable becoming possible in the way that Donald Trump talks to the American people. He's not the first right-wing populist demagogue to gain power in the Western world. It just so happens he's the first one in the United States to succeed at having become president and taking over one of our two political parties. And unfortunately, we all know what happens when someone with views like that, if they are able to have a long time hold on power.
Now, last time Trump was stalked by people like McMaster and John Bolton and all those people. Is he going to choose people like this again, or is it going to be like sort of puppets, you know?
Well, I think you put your finger on it exactly right. So people say, well, he's not going to be a dictator. Look what happened last time. He wasn't a dictator last time. Although he did try to overthrow an election that he lost, which is, I think, not democratic in a small d way. But you're right. The people that were around him in his first term who were more conventional Republicans or military officers or people who had some connection to the system are not going to be there the second time. The John Kellys, H.R. McMasters, Jim Mattis's, all of those people will not be there. He knows better than to let those people be around him because he doesn't want them to stop him. We interviewed for our book a national security official who spent a lot of time with Trump in the Oval Office, and this official compared him to the velociraptor in the first Jurassic Park movie. You remember the dinosaur movie, Jurassic Park? And there's a scene in there where the kids are running into the kitchen and they slam the heavy door shut and they think they're okay because the velociraptor won't be able to open the door. And then the velociraptor has learned to open the handle, right? And the person who made this comment to us said, Trump is like the velociraptor. He learns how to manipulate the system, and he has learned how, after 4 years, how to turn those levers. So he will be different in the second term. The things he couldn't get done in the first term, as Susan said, are things he'll try in the second term with more ease.
How is the experience of interviewing Trump in Mar-a-Lago or something like this? It must be an amazing experience, right, in itself?
Well, Peter and I did interview Donald Trump twice for our book on his 4 years in the White House called The Divider at Mar-a-Lago. First time he had us there in the lobby of Mar-a-Lago, and it's like a show, right? So he had all his interviews at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and all the people are coming in to dinner at his club there in Florida. And so he wants them to see you there in the lobby. And I mean, literally in the lobby. There's a sign right behind us, you know, sign up now for Mother's Day brunch. Remember, these are paying customers of Donald Trump that he has there. And the other thing is that it's not really an interview in the way that you're asking us questions and we're at least trying to answer them. Donald Trump doesn't listen to your question. He doesn't really care what it is. So we had a big plan. Okay, we want to talk about his 4 years in office. So, you know, let's not bring up the 2020 election first, because he'll just talk all about the rigged election, whatever. Yeah, guess what? How long did it take for him to talk about the rigged election? About 20 seconds. Trump is, it's funny because Biden gets all this attention right now for being old and is he, you know, stumbling on his words. Trump, when you talk to him, it's just like when you watch him on TV at one of the rallies. He cannot say a noun and a verb and a period. You know, it's all just one long kind of monologue, basically. Isn't that fair?
Yeah. It's all stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
You can't diagram a sentence. The difference is he gets away with the age issue, I think, through volume. And I mean that in a literal sense, volume. He speaks loudly. And I think the fact that he speaks loudly and bombastically covers the fact that some of what he's actually saying doesn't track, that it's not very coherent. The fact that he mixes up things all the time. He mixes up Obama for Biden. He mixes up one city for another. He thinks Hungary is next to Russia. And he covers for that because he speaks so loudly, people perceive him to be energetic, even though he's only 3 years younger than Biden.
Okay, as we're coming to the end of this, I want to ask you first of all, what does a Trump presidency mean for NATO? Article 5, there are a lot of people, our defense minister here, others, who are very curious to know, you know, what is that going to mean?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, you know, NATO Article 5 has had a long run. And if Donald Trump becomes president the second term, whether or not the United States formally pulls out of NATO or not, it's effectively dead in terms of the promise of mutual assistance. Because Donald Trump does not believe in the idea that the United States would go to war on behalf of all of its NATO partners. And that's the sacrosanct foundation of it. In fact, we report in our book that in 2018, he came much closer than people understand to actually withdrawing the United States from NATO, and was stopped at the last minute by John Kelly and John Bolton, his advisors at the time. John Bolton has said publicly that if Trump wins a second term, he will pull the United States out of NATO. But my point is that even if the United States formally remains in NATO, Donald Trump will never go to war to defend Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Poland, you know, they tried to give him a fort named after him. That was their strategy. They tried to name Fort Trump on the theory that maybe Donald Trump would be willing to support him. They have a new government that's taking office right now, Donald Tusk. Donald Trump hated Donald Tusk. He's not going to take American service members to war on behalf of them, never mind on behalf of Ukraine. So, you know, it's going to be potentially a different world. It's an election, I would say, in which the world has a very, very big stake. That it's not just about what's happening inside the United States, but it's going to have enormous repercussions here in Greece and throughout Europe.
So, the million-dollar question, who's going to win next year?
Oh, you know, look, everybody who made predictions in 2016 knows it's not a good idea to make predictions, okay? So I won't make any predictions. But I hear a lot when we travel here in Greece, and we were in Germany, and we were in Portugal earlier this year, and other places. And when we travel to Europe, the question we often get is, well, he can't actually win. Trump can't actually win again, right? And the answer is yes, he can. And it's very up in the air. It's very much a toss-up. Now, I think Susan's point is right, that he hasn't lost any support among his people, despite 91 felony counts. But he hasn't gained any either. So he has a certain rock-solid support that is what it is and is what it was, but it's not growing. He hasn't gain supporters, people were saying, oh my gosh, I voted against him, but since he's been charged with 91 felonies, I think I'll vote for him. Nobody's saying that. The problem for Biden is that he has lost people who did vote for him. In a poll the other day, Biden is holding on to 87% of the people who voted for him, and Donald Trump is holding on to 94% of the people who voted for him. So the question is, are the people who voted against Trump last time and voted for Biden, who are now disenchanted with Biden, going to turn out for him again, or will they stay at home? They're not going to vote for Trump, but they might stay at home. And that may be enough for Trump to win in the key states that he needs to win. And so, it's very much up in the air.
Susan?
Oh, I thought you were giving only the tough questions to people. Look, if the election were held today, I think it would be a very close-run thing. I have a profound conviction that 2024 is going to be some kind of a crazy year. I don't know what exactly that means, but I think that this is Biden talks about we're at an inflection point. Next year is a pretty big inflection point for the United States. So, we've never seen, there are going to be 4 criminal cases involving Donald Trump next year. They are going to be taking place concurrent with the campaign. This is something that not only has never happened in the United States, I can't think of any Western democracy in which such a thing has occurred. So it would be foolish to make predictions based on that. But we'll be happy to come back in a year and have a conversation about how it all turned out. Or at least we're hoping maybe, with Peter's Greek heritage, you'd be open for, a few more refugees if need be.
Well, I've been trying to think of an uplifting way to end this conversation. So what do you think of Greece these days? I never thought I would ask that question, in that way, but...
Hey, listen, you guys are flourishing, it seems to me, and we're delighted to see that the story about Greece internationally is a very, very different one than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful for me to be here. My father, you heard, was Greek. We lost him this year. He would be so delighted that we are here with you today, on stage with you today. And I think that I couldn't be happier than to be able to spend this time with you.
Well, if it gets too crazy over there, based on your Greek origins, we can always give you a Greek passport.
There you go.
You can join us with Susan.
Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thank
it was
you.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
That was perfect.
Thanks.